You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 26th of August, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The Middle East braces for impact. Ukraine sees how Russia likes having its territory invaded and annexed, and the world's worst breakdancer becomes national hero. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Michael Binion and Lynn O'Donnell will discuss today's big stories, and we'll speak to the author of a new book exploring the inner lives of notable people on the autistic spectrum, Daniel Tammet, who knows of what he writes. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Michael Binion, Foreign Affairs Specialist for The Times, and Lynn O'Donnell, columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. Hello to you both.
Hi.
Hi.
We have all recently been places, as regular listeners of the Daily, like there are any other kind, will be wearily aware. I have spent the last 2 weeks broadcasting from a superb vista overlooking all of Paris from the 16th floor of a hotel on the banks of the river. So obviously I'm enthralled to be back here in our windowless bunker at Midori House, which is in every sense an improvement. But Lynn, you have been in Karachi for actually quite a stretch. Would you recommend it as a summer holiday destination?
It was fascinating. It's one of the most energetic cities that I've ever been to, but also one of the filthiest. And
energetic sounds like one of those Daily Telegraph obituary euphemisms.
Yes, like flamboyant. I loved it, but tough. It's physically the toughest place that I have ever been, I must say, and I've been to some places.
Well, exactly. Listeners familiar with your career would know that is quite the accolade. What were you actually doing there?
I was teaching a summer course to graduate students of journalism at a university called the Institute of Business Administration, which has a centre for excellence in journalism.
See, that does sound like it would have been a genuinely interesting experience, because these kids, if they're planning on practising their trade at home, are setting themselves up for a career in which I think it's fair to say a free press has not been historically valued by Pakistan's government.
Quite the opposite. I found it a really fascinating experience because, yes, these kids were kind of naive but excited about launching into a journalism career. But the many friends that I have in the media, in journalism in Pakistan are challenged daily. And one of them, as you might remember, even spent some time in solitary confinement in the same prison as Imran Khan earlier this year. That's how they treat journalists, with contempt.
And Michael, you have been, quite a way afield. I suspect a slightly less stressful trip. But why does one go to St. Helena, in which, of course, having recently visited Napoleon's tomb, I am now massively interested?
Indeed, yes. Well, I saw where he started off in his tomb for the 19 years before his body was taken back to France. Well, I've been there. Actually, this was my 6th visit. I'm become a bit of a buff for St. Helena. It's difficult to get to. There's only one flight a week from South Africa, and the airport is pretty hairy. It really is. It's built on top of a cliff. But I went there because I'm chairman of the Britain's St. Helena Trust, and it's to raise money to just maintain all the buildings that were associated with Napoleon's time, all the battlements and the fortifications. And there were 2,000 troops guarding him on this tiny little island. And, of course, many of these historic things are falling into ruin. So I went out with 2 architects to look at what can be done to preserve some of these sites, and also the big role that St. Helena played in liberating slaves that were being taken by Portuguese traders from Africa to Brazil, and they were liberated by the Royal Navy, brought them to St. Helena.
And just finally on St. Helena, Michael, would you recommend it, notwithstanding what I'm sure could be a fairly alarming descent into the airport, would you recommend visiting?
It's amazing. Thoroughly. 100% recommend. Wonderful place. Amazing, varied place. Tiny, but you feel you're in several continents all at once.
Well, any listeners who were on the fence there between Karachi and St. Helena have just had their minds made up. We will be starting in the Middle East as the region braces for threatened retaliations against Israel for a pair of actions conducted late last month. The assassinations of Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and Hezbollah military commander Fuad Shakur in Beirut. Iran appears to be trying to calibrate a response which will exceed its designed-to-fail missile barrage against Israel in April, but without prompting disaster in return. Hezbollah may be adjusting its thinking in relation to the looming proximity of the US Navy strike group attached to the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, which has been dispatched to the eastern Mediterranean by way of discouragement. Michael, where do you think Iran is thinking on this? Do they feel like, again, as I think they did in April, OK, after their consulate was bombed in Damascus, OK, we have to do something, but we don't want to do maybe too much?
I think that's still very much their thinking, particularly as the president who is now has succeeded the hardliner who was killed in a helicopter crash is very much more of a moderate and has appointed a more moderate, pragmatic person as his foreign
I do always
minister.
feel it necessary to make the point that moderate and pragmatic
moderate in
very
Iranian terms.
Very relative terms.
Yes, in Iranian terms, yes. But it is a real dilemma for them because a second strike by Israel on a target in Tehran, I mean, that can't go unanswered. I mean, the regime's got to do something. And how they calibrate it so that it looks as though they're attacking without inviting enormous retaliation is difficult to see. They're obviously waiting to see what the American reaction will be. There may even be some kind of discreet hints via third-party countries to the Americans about what they might do so that the Americans can prepare for it.
Which I think is pretty certainly what happened in April. But Lynn, what to make of the promise of Israel's Defence Minister Yoav Gallant that, and I quote, "Whoever harms us in a way that has not been done in the past," that is him echoing Iran's threats, "is likely to be hit in a way that hasn't been done in the past." This is basically come and have a go if you think you're hard enough.
Well, I think over the last couple of weeks, Israel has pretty well proved that it can and will hit and has undermined Iran's own security quite substantially and publicly. So, yeah, I think they're to be taken seriously.
I mean, just following up on the Iran thing as well, I mean, there is no way we could know, but we have to assume that the recriminations within the Revolutionary Guard Corps must be considerable because clearly somebody very high up in Iran told the Israelis exactly where they could find Ismail Haniyeh and when.
And when, that's right. So heads rolling behind closed doors, yeah, most probably. But I think that, you know, what happens eventually does come out. And I would imagine that, like you say, there is internal retaliation and that we could see, even though the, you know, moderates in relative terms are in the ascendancy, we could see that reversing very soon. This is a very, very has been a very serious assault on Iran's inability to keep itself safe internally on its own territory. Maybe you start at home before you start projecting outwards.
Michael, these calculations are somewhat macabre, especially when the targeting of individuals is concerned. But do you think Israel operates a similar calibration, thinking, OK, whacking Fuad Shakur, maybe even whacking Ismail Haniyeh, we can probably get away with that? Would Israel be thinking, if they knew where to find them, that the likes of Sheikh Naim Qassem and Hassan Nasrallah should perhaps not be sleeping too soundly either?
Well, it's extraordinary how much Israel thinks it can get away with and does. I mean, it's not just hitting Iranians, it's bombing hospitals and schools and goodness knows what in Gaza, and they're getting tut-tut from America, having killed however many people it is, almost 40,000 Palestinians in Gaza, according to the latest toll, and all they get is a promise of another 3.5 billion in arms from America at the same time. So the Israelis are, feeling pretty self-confident that basically they're being allowed to do whatever they think is in their security. And if that means hitting at enemies in Beirut or taking out the chief of Hamas just at a time when people were hoping that some deal would be done with Hamas, well, too bad. I don't think the Netanyahu government has any serious intention of doing a deal with Hamas in any case.
Perhaps not, but do you think Israel is still correct in making that assumption that there is no limit to the United States' patience? Because their thinking must have been changed by the change in the American political race, because they probably would have been thinking, OK, Biden or Trump, they're both broadly on board as far as you can ever rely on anything where Trump is concerned. Vice President Harris's language in recent days has been much more, I think, explicit than Biden's in saying this has to stop.
Yes, and she said there has to be a deal and that the casualties are excessive. Well, I mean, she's not the only statesman to say that. What matters is what actually is the follow-up. She's only the vice president at the moment. She is a candidate, but she doesn't actually have power. If she has power, well, it wouldn't be till November, and then other things could have happened by then. So I don't think they're too worried. What matters now is what Washington will do under the Biden presidency, which is still in charge.
Just finally on this, Lynn, one individual obviously still very, well, at large seems the wrong word for somebody who I suspect has spent most of the last 10 months underground, but Yahya Sinwar, now anointed political chief of Hamas as well as chief of its military wing in Gaza. Once Israel get him, which I assume they do regard very much as one of their war aims, is that it? Is that where we can imagine Israel thinking, OK, we've made our point?
You know, as Michael was saying, is 40,000 casualties not a point having been made already? I don't think so. I think that the calculation personally for Netanyahu is his own power, his own position, and that their war aims, which are the destruction of Hamas and the return of the hostages, have not yet been met. And as long as they are still pursuing those goals, they have self-justification to keep going.
Well, let's look now at Ukraine. And 902 days since the launch of Russia's 72-hour lightning conquest of Kyiv, Russian President Vladimir Putin finds himself in the awkward position of banging the end of his weird long table and vowing to drive Ukraine out of the chunk of Kursk Oblast it has rather audaciously seized over the last 6 days. More than 100,000 Russian civilians have been evacuated from the path of the oncoming Ukrainians, several brigades of whom now control more than 1,000 square kilometres of Russian territory and are in some places reported to be digging trenches, suggesting no intention of imminent retreat. Michael, it's hard, frankly, not to find this somewhat amusing, but from Ukraine's point of view, what is the strategic logic? Because this is not a risk-free endeavour if the reports are true that they have committed thousands of troops to this enterprise.
It's not risk-free at all, and they are expecting an enormous Russian retaliation. They're already talking about a huge bombardment of Kiev and possibly other blanket missile strikes in revenge. The calculation was that the Russians would be taken by surprise, which they were, and they would rush their troops and their aircraft back from the Eastern Front, where there was huge pressure around Kharkiv and the other towns on the front line there, and they would come back to try to push the Ukrainians out, which they're trying now to do. And so to that extent, they have relieved the pressure on the war front in eastern Ukraine, but they're now gearing up probably for a massive retaliation. The other problem is, although it makes huge military sense to take the fight to the enemy, the optics are not very good in the West. If the idea is that the Ukrainians are invading Russia, as it were, and killing civilians in Russia. I mean, I know that that's what the Russians have been doing en masse for 2 years or more in Ukraine.
Worth pointing out that as of yet at least, and I can't imagine it's likely to happen, Ukraine have not been doing the Russian thing of levelling entire cities as they go.
Luckily, no, they haven't. But I mean, inevitably, civilians will get killed and houses will be flattened. And that is war. But it doesn't look quite so good in the West. And there's always the worry, particularly in America, of escalation so that NATO is pulled into an actual outright confrontation. After all, the Russians have said several times that if their own territory is threatened in a serious way, they would be ready to use nuclear weapons, or tactical nuclear weapons. They said that. I think it's a bluff, but the fact they have said it is a bit alarming.
But on that front, Lynn, and it is remarkable placed in that context and in the wider context that over 2 years and a bit of this war, we have seen this 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 4 steps sideways thing of Ukraine's allies being extremely nervous about whether the next thing is too much. And this went all the way back to, like, should we send them a few tanks? And then we're now at a position where we have sent not merely tanks, but we have sent long-range missiles, we have sent F-16s, we have sent all sorts of things. And now we see Ukraine actually taking Russian territory, presumably at the very least with the aid of NATO-supplied equipment. Has for some reason everybody simply stopped caring what Vladimir Putin's red lines may be?
Stopped caring? I don't know about that. I think that these tactics are very interesting because, like Michael was saying, it does thin out the front lines, the Russian front lines. It also is likely to alarm the Russian public and maybe see pressure on the government and the military, and possibly cut logistics and supply lines, and have some impact on the Russian military assault ongoing in Ukraine. So I can't really see. I don't think that it's a bad thing, to be honest with you. I think that it's likely to work in Ukraine's favour by showing that they are committed, that they do have the resources, that they know how to use all the stuff that they have been sent. And the other thing that you didn't mention, the impact on this has been the expansion of NATO. I'm kind of in a hats off to the Ukrainians on this.
I mean, I think, Michael, there is probably among a lot of people who have sympathised with Ukraine and really who wouldn't, who do kind of hope that at some level this does end with, Volodymyr Zelensky running up the blue and gold standard over Lenin's tomb in Red Square. It does seem like the least Russia would deserve. But on that thought, do we think it is possible Ukraine is trying to do something as basically obvious as setting up, a land swap, saying, fine, you want this back? Give us back what belongs to us?
That would be a sensible position if they can hold it. They've shaken the Russian military. Again, there's massive criticism of the Russian military leadership, and that's not for the first time. They do seem pretty incompetent. They get the initiative, then it works for a while, then all of a sudden the Ukrainians do something which takes them by surprise, and again they're shown up to be too clumsy, too slow, not helping themselves. Putin will be furious about this because it is a big shake to Russian morale. It will alarm the ordinary public. In some extent, it will actually galvanize the Russian public in supporting Putin more. They say, look, they really are invading our territory. This is a threat from NATO, which is what the story was right from the beginning. And they can say, look, they're taking our people, levelling our buildings and this sort of thing. So, I mean, it works both ways. But on the idea that the Ukrainians trying to put themselves into a better position for when negotiations start, yes, I think that is certainly a consideration, because this thing will have to end in one way or another by some kind of deal or some kind of talks. There won't be a peace treaty at all. Nobody trusts anyone. But there may be the Chinese intervening with some kind of suggested freeze of where things are at the moment. And if there's a freeze, then there's either some kind of territorial swap or there's a sort of adjustment of the borders so that basically things stay as they are on the front line at the moment.
Well, sticking with the subject of humiliating military collapses, it is 3 years, give or take, since the Taliban were permitted to saunter back into Kabul and back into power, amid scenes of grotesque violence and chaos as the United States and its allies abandoned a 20-year attempt to haul Afghanistan towards maybe the middle of the 20th century or so. The 3 years since have not been a golden era in Afghanistan's history. Despite wistful talk 3 years back of Taliban 2.0, the Taliban's thinking on such matters as female emancipation, education, democracy and human rights appear to have evolved little since their previous stint in charge. Lynn, you were there on one of the last, if not the last, commercial flights out of Kabul, as I remember. What do you recall of that period now? What has stuck with you?
Well, I was there for the last 4 months of that war, and I went all over the country and reported from front lines wherever I went. And I was struck by, well, number one, the bravery of the Afghan forces, even as the Americans were drawing down, but also by the demoralisation of the public. It was only ever a matter of time once Trump had done his deal with the Taliban, which was bilateral, totally bipartisan, past the Afghan government and the Afghan people. And that really sealed it for the Afghan Republic. That Biden stood by it and stuck with that deal. Looking back at it, as brutal as it may sound, I don't really see what choice he had. It was a collapsing state, phenomenally corrupt, poverty and the treatment of women were amongst the worst in the world. Corruption certainly was too. So now, 3 years later, through all that rubbish that we heard about Taliban 2.0, the Taliban really told us who they were and who they are. There are no surprises for anybody who knows anything about them at all. And Afghanistan has basically been turned into a terrorist narco state. Heroin's being swapped
as it
out
was
from
prior to 2001.
Well, exactly, but now it's just worse, and now it's being done with the approval and the cooperation of the Western powers via the United Nations and the United States. So no surprises, to be honest with you, as tragic as it is.
But to follow that up, Lynn, was there a parallel universe here? Because I spoke at the time, and I'm sure you did too, to people who were very intimately involved with the intervention in Afghanistan, some of whom said that we could have hung on to Kabul basically forever. It would have been a fairly easy city for the United States and its allies to secure, a kind of West Berlin analogue, if you like, where an amount of democracy and freedom could have been encouraged, which perhaps might have taken root elsewhere eventually. If the will and the budget for that had been there, was that actually doable?
I don't think so. I was there as cities collapsed. And as those cities collapsed and Kabul was the last one standing, thousands and thousands of people from all over the country were flooding in. And in those last few days, nothing worked. The ATMs ran out of cash. The traffic was absolutely gridlocked. All hotels and apartments were absolutely full. People were camping without loos or bathroom facilities or any sort of hygiene in open spaces, in public parks. There was absolutely no way Kabul could have survived had that situation prevailed. It was a siege. You would have had a city that was growing under siege. And the Taliban's strategy had been to take the country from the outside in. So the first thing they did was close all the border points, which meant nothing was coming in. It's a landlocked country. You need imported goods, food, whatever. None of that was happening. So what do? You just wait it out and wait for a few million people to starve until you give up? Nah.
Is the reality then, Michael, that if anybody is interested in helping Afghanistan's people, and anything you read about Afghanistan's current state is about the most depressing thing you're going to read, that really, if we were realistic about it and actually wanted to do it, we would have to go back in much the same way we did in 2001?
Well, possibly, except the only other alternative is to do some kind of deal with the Taliban, a horrible, horrific regime intent on enslaving women and growing drugs, as Lynn said, and doing all sorts of appalling things. But the people they're the ones in charge. And if you want to relieve the huge medical emergency and supply some drugs which are desperately needed, or try to get food in, you're probably going to have to work with the people who are there. So the alternative Western strategy is to recognise them with great reluctance and then try to moderate the way they run the country by steering them into a slightly more pragmatic form of government.
I mean, Lynn, just a final thought on this, if, and recognition is something they do fairly transparently want, but if that was forthcoming, are they the kind of people that can be steered towards anything more moderate? Didn't we try this a bit in the late 90s?
I don't think so, because this is ideological. There is no they believe that they are correct. It's a state now built on a misguided interpretation of quite unreconstructed Islamic law. So no, and they keep getting everything they want. I mean, we just recently saw the third Doha meeting that brought states, the UN and the Taliban together, and the Taliban said no women. So guess what? No women. So 50% of the population is just utterly invisible. So they keep getting what they want. And as long as they keep getting what they want, because, gosh, we've got to talk to the Taliban, they will dig in. They are unreconstructible. So, no, I don't think recognition is going to make any difference at all.
Well, to the recently concluded Olympic Games, at which Australia won 4 more gold medals than Great Britain. While this is literally the only metric that matters, sorry, Michael, it just is, it is nevertheless the case that all of Australia's considerable athletic excellence seems likely to be occluded in the popular consciousness by the sensational haplessness of Australia's contender in the female tournament of breaking, a sport making its first Olympic appearance, and possibly thanks to the efforts of Dr. Rachel Gunn, aka inevitably Ray Gunn, its last. Lynn, where did you come down on Ray Gunn's, I don't even know what to call it, performance? Whatever it was she was doing.
Whatever it was. Breakdancing, I thought breakdancing went out a long time ago. Apparently not. I mean, I'm more inclined to think that skateboarding has more merit as a sport than breakdancing does. So, you know...
Point of order, and I was corrected on this by one of the organisers of this section of the Games. Competitively, it is breaking, not breakdancing.
Ah, yes, of course. Silly me. If it is the last time, I don't think I'll miss it in LA, and LA still hasn't said whether or not they're going to include it. So... You know.
What I liked about this, Michael, is that there is a popular joke that does the rounds about the Olympics that at every event they should just pluck some rando out of the crowd and send them out with the field to demonstrate how impossible what these people are doing actually is. They pretty much did it here.
Yeah, they seem to have done, yes. I mean, and she took it into her head to dance like a kangaroo, and it doesn't seem to have done her or the Olympic image very much good. Actually, I'm rather grateful to her because I think it looks so ridiculous, and it brought into disrepute and, in fact, made a laughingstock of the whole idea of breaking being an Olympic sport. It's not an Olympic sport at all. It's something you go and see round the back of the town, you know, wherever you live in. Watch some kids do it there. That's where it belongs.
But a great many sports started as exactly
I suppose they did. Yeah, maybe even cricket did, but or whatever. But no, I think it's absurd, and I'm sorry for her. She's sort of humiliated herself. But does it matter?
Well, that does prompt the question, Lynn. Has she in fact humiliated herself? Because I quite enjoyed the way that you could see the vibe shift on social media. She was much mocked by the whole world, including Australia. And then when Australians realised that the whole world was mocking her as well, you started to get Australians go, well, hang on a second.
Yeah.
She's one of us, ultimately. And there were those lovely scenes before the closing ceremony of the rest of the Australian Olympic team cheering her through the village. I mean, there is no way when she gets home, if she handles this right, that she is not made for life, is
She's
there?
Eddie the Eagle. She's a female
exactly
Eddie the Eagle.
Yes. Yeah, but on the other hand, she's also an Olympic athlete. She can say for the rest of her life that she competed in the Olympics, and not many of us can say that.
Regrettably not, although has the bar been lowered? 4 years to practice, Michael.
Yeah, I'll be in it. I'll be there. Lower and lower.
We look forward to it. Michael Binion and Lynn O'Donnell, thanks both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, one of the impediments to fully understanding neurodevelopmental conditions is that it is generally difficult for people who have them to explain what it's like to people who do not. Daniel Tammett's 2006 memoir, Born on a Blue Day, was therefore something of a breakthrough, a lucid and often funny account of life as a savant, possessed of an ability to perform astonishing feats of memory and learning. His latest book, 9 Minds, Inner Lives on the Spectrum, reflects on that many people who figure somewhere on the autistic spectrum, some famous, some not, and gently makes the point that it's not necessarily a weakness. I spoke to Daniel at Midori House earlier and began by asking what he'd hoped to demonstrate about the lives of his subjects.
So 9 Minds tells the stories of 9 neurodivergent, what we call neurodivergent men and women, so people who are somewhere on the autistic spectrum. The book focuses on their gifts, their talents, Some are incredibly famous, like the comic actor Dan Aykroyd, for example. And there's also a Fields Medal winning mathematician and politician from France. His name is Cédric Villani. There's also the best-selling novelist Nisha Dolan. But most of the 9 are not famous. They are distinguished in their fields. A surgeon, for example, or an academic who studies loneliness based on her own personal experience, for example. I was really interested in their inner lives, how autistic dreams, desires, imagination, how that looks from the inside out. Obviously, I'm drawing on my own personal experience as an autistic writer. But it feels to me, and it has felt for a long time, that literature needed those stories, that it would be richer for those stories. We've come from a period where, in the not very distant past, women's voices were not often represented in literature, black voices, LGBT ones. And it seems to me this is a moment where neurodivergent voices as well and stories need to be heard and told, and it makes literature that much richer for them.
I mean, as you've explained, you do have a natural advantage in articulating the inner minds of neurodivergent people, but is that a source of frustration, do you think, that for a lot of people who are autistic, it's very hard to explain to people who aren't what that is actually like?
Yes. I mean, it can be very difficult for all kinds of reasons. One is obviously there's a proportion of neurodivergent people who are nonverbal. So one of the 9 people is a nonverbal young man from America, and obviously I spoke extensively with his mother, his family, to learn about his story and the ways that he learns to communicate with music, with play, with drumming and drawing, and he uses a computer device as well to communicate with. But even for those who are verbal, it can be difficult to find the words. For me, it was very difficult growing up. I grew up in East London. There wasn't a vocabulary at the time. Neurodiversity was not a concept. Autism itself was very little known. Rain Man, the movie, only came out at the end of the 80s. I was already 10 by that time. I saw myself and didn't see myself at the same time in that character, played by Dustin Hoffman. And so it was about trying to find a vocabulary, trying to find a language in which to make these stories accessible to every kind of reader, what we call neurotypical readers. And that's what I try to do with these stories. I'm both trying to dive really deep into these different talents and abilities and imaginations, which can be incredibly different to how other people's minds work, and at the same time resonate, because they're stories of hope and dreams and desires and frustrations and challenges overcome. And that's something that obviously appeals to everyone. It's a universal theme in any event.
I mean, was writing about other people's experiences of it, or attempting to articulate other people's experiences of it, any kind of reaction to your first couple of books, Born on a Blue Day, Embracing the Wide Sky? Because people did tend to get fixated, and not unreasonably, on the flashbang stuff, the fact that you can do extraordinary arithmetic in your head, that you can recite pi to 22,000 places. Please don't do that. We don't have all day. And that you can teach yourself entire languages in a extraordinarily short span of time. Did you react against that a bit, that you sort of get asked to go on people's programs and do all the tricks?
So part of it is just getting older. When I was in my 20s, I was wanting to tell a story that was very simple, and it wasn't, Born on a Blue Day wasn't necessarily a writer's book. It was a book that I had to write in order to become a writer. I had to learn the craft. And later, yes, there was always a little bit of frustration that critics would not necessarily look at the quality of what I was doing, although there were writers, very important writers. There was a Nobel Prize in Literature winner, Kurt Coetzee from South Africa, who very kindly wrote a blurb for my third book, Thinking in Numbers. Amy Tan, best-selling novelist, award-winning novelist, has written wonderful blurbs of several of my books. She's followed me for a long time now. So there's been that appreciation within the literary field itself, but it's true that for many critics, and that's something that it wasn't really recognised necessarily for a long time. It's changing now. It's catching up. People are catching up with the reality of autistic writers, that we exist, we write well, maybe even as well as our neurotypical peers. Why shouldn't we? Since we have this very fusional relationship with words, we explore sentences in our head for hours at a time. That's something that's good for writing, it's good for readers. And these are amazing stories. I think, obviously, I'm also leaning into these incredible stories. So, for example, about the detective in Birmingham who uses his autism to solve murders, able to hone in on the tiniest clues that perhaps his neurotypical peers are unable to see, to perceive. That's a story that writes itself, in some respects, And also Amanda, the Australian in the book, who is both autistic and blind and can perceive the world using what we call echolocation, similar to what bats and whales do. If she comes into a room, she can hear the dimension, she can hear the number of people, she can hear if there's a bottle of water, she can hear if it's half full or 3/4 full. Apparently, the bottle will make a different sound in her mind depending on the volume of water it contains. So these are not caricatures. These are characters, but they're never caricatures.
Because I was interested in that comparison you drew earlier in this chat between the way that it is only relatively in recent times and not in most of the world that there has been a greater willingness to listen in all fields to women, to not white people, to gay people, etc. And I think only the most insane bigot would deny that those places that have embraced those groups of people are vastly the richer for it. Is it your contention that neurodiversity or neurodiverse people are also a potentially untapped resource of that magnitude?
Absolutely. In literature, most obviously, just because there is that gap there that the book is there to fill, that it seems incredible to me to imagine that the stories of neurotypical lives, neuroatypical lives are just not present, very rare in conversations around books and literature. And where they do exist, where they have existed in the past, they've been told in neurotypical words. So, for example, Oliver Sacks tells the story of neurodivergent men from the 1970s, 80s, twins who could count very quickly and do all kinds of calculations in their head, love prime numbers. Obviously, that's something that speaks to me very, very, very much. But when I read Oliver Sacks, who I admire very much, obviously, as a writer, he describes them as a grotesque Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They were twins, or absurd little professors. Obviously,
this is still the freak show aspect of it.
And that's something that obviously I think even he's obviously passed away since, but if he were writing today, he wouldn't use those words, I'm sure of it. But it goes to show the fact that even when those stories were being told, they were told very superficially, and the inner lives of those men, I'm sure, would have been fascinating. But it would have taken a writer sensitive enough to that and empathetic enough to that reality, which is, it doesn't matter that neurotypical people don't necessarily get it. They get it just fine if only they can find it in them to treat these individuals as human beings with lives just as rich as anyone else.
That was Daniel Tammet speaking to me earlier. His new book, 9 Minds, Inner Lives on the Spectrum, is available now and very much recommended. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Lynn O'Donnell and Michael Binion. The show was produced by Henry Rhys Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.